The King's Speech, Knives Out, and an education.
No, we're not talking through our favourite films. We've got a stuffed episode of political news for you. I'm Coco Khan.
I'm Nish Kumar, and this is Pod Save the UK.
This week, we're poring over King Charles's address at the state opening of Parliament. We're diving into what Welsh First Minister Vaughan Gething's resignation might mean for Keir Starmer, and we're exploring the challenges and opportunities that Secretary of State for Education Bridget Phillipson faces over the coming years. But first,
I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over.
A fascinating first message from Donald Trump's newly appointed running mate, JD Vance, in that clip from The Guardian. To discuss this intriguing development, we're joined by the closest friend of the pod. Welcome back to the show, Liz Bates. How are you?
I guess I'm sort of more the official pod stalker. We were just saying before, it's kind of baby reindeer vibes, a little bit, but, maybe a sort of a gentler version of that.
Poddy reindeer.
Poddy reindeer, yeah.
so returning to JD Vance.
Yes.
Must we?
Yeah, well, sadly, I think we do need to talk about this. I think the first thing I'm interested in, Liz, Trump mania.
Sure.
What do you think? Is the spirit of this current presidential campaign going to match, way back when, cast our minds back to the original Trump, that feeling of certain opinions let out the box? And are you excited?
Sure.
Sure.
I think it's the realignment of politics. We've seen it in the UK and we've seen it in the US as well. And I think to some extent, the Pandora's box is open. We know what Trump is about. That kind of flavour of US politics is back with a vengeance. And I think JD Vance, certainly encapsulates some of that. I mean, the thing that I thought was interesting about that particular comment that he made about the UK, it's going to be a difficult period of time for the Labour Party as they try to row back on some of the things that they've said about Trump, as they look at the prospect of a Trump presidency and all that means for the world, and try to navigate how can they put their politics aside and keep kind of good relationships with the Trump administration in a way that kind of benefits this country and the rest of the world. And then you see JD Vance speak, and the thing that really struck me was like, he doesn't give a fuck about us.
No. Yeah.
The relationship is so one way. We're constantly wringing our hands thinking, how do we keep this special relationship going? Even when our politics is very, very different, and they could not care less. Like, to him, it wasn't even just the content. It's a joke. To him, the UK is something that you can talk about in a way that they're a joke. They don't matter. And if he offends us, they don't care.
Yeah.
And so I think that is really a very worrying approach to politics, and it's a massive problem for the Labour Party.
Well, look, obviously, listeners to this podcast will, I'm sure, be following Pod Save America, who are doing daily dispatches from the RNC and talking about the reaction to JD Vance's comments and the speeches that were made at the RNC, and obviously the continued fallout and the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. But we are obviously going to focus on the kind of British implications of this. And as you say, it's put the Labour Party in quite a difficult position. David Lammy had been trying to cultivate relations with JD Vance and had described him as a friend, I believe, a recent public appearance they made. Angela Rayner has made some comments on ITV's Good Morning Britain that were, I think, pretty measured in tone. So it's worth listening to that. This is Angela Rayner.
Well, I think he said quite a lot of fruity things in the past as well. Look, I don't recognise that characterisation. I'm very proud of the election success that Labour had recently. We won votes across all different communities across the whole of the country, and we're interested in governing on behalf of Britain and also working with our international allies. So I look forward to that meeting if that is the result, and it's up to the American people to decide.
Yes, it is up to the American people to decide, and the UK is not an Islamist country, and inshallah, the Republicans will not win in November.
Inshallah.
I'm not engaging with this. I'm just going to keep it. Let's keep it moving.
It does make things difficult. In all seriousness, though, Liz, before we move on, it does make things slightly complicated for a Labour government which is so closely politically aligned to the Biden administration in so many ways. It does present some potential complications.
It's hard. And, look, going from 14 years in opposition and going into government, it's so easy to fall into the trap of feeling like you want to stand up, especially when someone like Trump is about to become president, and all of the things that he has said and the things that he represents. I think there's always the temptation to want to call it out.
Yeah.
And to want to sort of speak up for the UK. But on the other hand, this is real grown-up shit. The things that they're talking about are, pulling back a little bit from NATO, and leaving Ukraine to kind of basically be occupied by Russia. That has the most serious implications for us as a country. And, you can see that is the first steps to this type of global instability that we just have not seen and witnessed, particularly in Europe.
Yeah.
And so the responsibility now falls to this government. They have to, as difficult as that might feel, and as difficult as it might be for them, particularly in this country, and how their voters might feel about that, they have to be close to that administration. We need their military power. We need their backing. We need their money.
I believe, actually, a recommitment to NATO was included in the King's speech today, which brings me nicely onto the King's speech.
So smooth.
Thank you very much. For any of our listeners who are not familiar with the King's speech, the main thing to know is that it's got not really much to do with the King himself. He hasn't written it. It's really a ceremonial speech that's written by the government of the day, in this case, Labour, for the first time since 2009. And it essentially sets out the government's policy ambitions for the coming year. It's a press release, basically. Imagine a mega ermine, velvet, bejewelled press release. So here's a clip from King Charles speaking in the House of Lords on Wednesday.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will govern in service to the country. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all.
So a huge blizzard of policy announcements, 40 bills and draft bills announced in the King's speech. For regular listeners of the pod, most of this is going to feel very familiar. Liz, what are your highlights from the King's speech? Not many surprises, right?
I think no surprises. Yeah. And I think that's quite consistent with the way that the Labour Party have been. I mean, they set out over the past couple of years this quite detailed programme for government, all of the different things that they wanted to do, and Keir Starmer giving all these speeches about his missions, etc. And we saw that in the election campaign with the manifesto, that there were no surprises in that either. It was very similar actually to the content of the King's speech, which, as you say, is just basically like a big long press release.
Huge focus on the economy, huge focus on driving growth, and also liberalising planning, fighting NIMBYism, and pushing housing. That's going to be a divisive element of the bill, the housing stuff, because
it always is.
This one is because it takes powers to block development away from local authorities, right? It's centralising some of that decision making.
It does, and that's one of the major blocks, and always has been in this country, is that, locally people do have a lot of power to oppose housing developments, and have done. And the way that the political system tends to work in this country, because we have local MPs, they tend to, it doesn't really matter which party they're from, they always oppose big housing developments, because everybody wants there to be more houses, and people want their kids to be able to get on the housing ladder, and for, the rental sector to be better, etc., to increase supply. But nobody really wants houses to be built where they live. And so this will be a big challenge. I mean, the Conservatives put a plan on the table during their time in office, and it was actually quite a good plan. It was basically masterminded by Dominic Cummings, who, doesn't give a fuck really about, as we know, Conservative politicians and whether they care about planning laws. And he was kind of willing to rip up the system that we have in place and really push through. Especially one of the things was in like the beautiful places, places where there are Tory MPs and Tory councils and lots of rolling hills, and he just couldn't get it past the party, and that we see that time and time again in British politics because it's just so unpopular locally, and the MPs and the councillors squeal. That's the thing. You end up with so many pissed off MPs, and it makes your party basically ungovernable. So this is the situation that the Labour Party will be facing. So good luck to them. And the thing is about NIMBYism, I have some sympathy for it, not because I have a secret country pile that I'm trying to protect. Like, you know, I'm living in a terrace house where we get sunlight for like half an hour a day because we're just surrounded by buildings. But because you actually go and look at places where there are big housing developments, you kind of assume that they're going to just be boomers sitting in their lovely house in the middle of the countryside and just being, you know, precious about it. And actually what you find is like pretty normal people, like whatever, in a semi-detached house. I've done a lot of coverage of this, and they kind of beckon you into the back garden, and they have this like small back garden that goes onto like a field, and they'll point to it and be like, we're going to have 250 houses built on there, and it's going to take 7 years, and we can't sell our house, and the value of our house has dropped, and we don't know whether, you know, what our retirement's going to be like. And you just feel like, that is shit.
Yeah.
That is really shit. So when you actually see it up close, it's you understand why there is so much local resistance to it.
Rushing through a couple of other things, we should just say on housing, we didn't mention the Renters Reform Bill, which is back on the table, ending the no-fault evictions. That's a huge thing, a really good piece of legislation that was put forward by the Conservatives that then sort of ended up getting delayed and then eventually just dropped when the election was called. That's back on the table. The return of the smoking ban and Great British Energy, which is another big thing.
Everything in the King's speech, well, most of it speaks to this Labour ambition of growth, right?
Yeah.
That's all of these policies are related to their vision of how Britain is going to grow. Obviously, you know, there's been a lot of criticism of that and how long will it take to deliver, and people are expecting changes in the, you know, first few years. Were there any surprises though from the King's speech?
I don't think so. I mean, I think they've been pretty meticulous in setting out exactly what they want to do. And I think you're right. The theme of it is growth. And the interesting thing about planning is you can't wave a magic wand and get growth.
Yeah.
Like otherwise, every single politician everywhere all the time would do it because, you know, growth is something that is, you know, delivers so many benefits and what most governments aim for because it makes people feel positive. But you have to kind of try to slot lots of different things into place. And one of the things that can really drive growth is planning reform because that fuels the construction sector. And that is a sector that really drives the rest of the economy. And you're right, GB Energy is exactly the same type of thing, but it will be a kind of a mixture, a cocktail of things. And we'll have to kind of see if it all comes together.
So look, I mean, you know, there's, I guess, plenty for the Labour Party to be positive about, potential problems down the road. One problem that is not very far down the road and is in fact right in front of them in the road and is causing potentially a severe traffic accident is the situation in Wales. That metaphor really got away from me very quickly. But there has been huge news from Wales where First Minister Vaughan Gething has resigned after 4 of his ministers tendered their resignation. Gething, who was Europe's first black leader of any European country, was in the job for less than 4 months after winning the premiership in a close run race with rival Jeremy Miles. One of the 4 ministers who resigned and is currently the likely frontrunner to replace him.
Gething's premiership has been dogged by scandal in regard to a £200,000 donation from the firm of a man previously convicted of environmental offences. In regard to that, Gething wrote that, quote, a growing assertion that some kind of wrongdoing has taken place has been pernicious. It's politically motivated and it's patently untrue. In 11 years as a minister, I have never, ever made a decision for personal gain. I have never, ever misused or abused my ministerial responsibilities.
Liz, Starmer and Gething were pretty cosy over the course of the campaign. Labour also did very, very well in Wales, picking up 9 extra seats. But is this now a problem for Starmer?
So it's not going to be like you're going to see, you know, weeks of Keir Starmer being confronted about this problem. I think the dynamic in Wales is such that, and we've seen it happen before, that if you have one party that's dominant in a region for a long time, and you know, particularly if there's a period of stability under one leader, so Mark Drakeford, then what happens is things kind of ferment. under the surface. And I think there's a bit of factionalism that has been brewing in Wales and the Labour Party. And I think you could see voters over time move away from Labour in Wales. And so I think it could be a long-term problem. It's starting to feel a bit chaotic. It has that kind of SNP in Scotland feel, end of days, type of thing. And so I think if I was the Labour Party, I would be thinking, okay, we need to get a grip of this in Wales, otherwise it's going to drift. If it drags and drags, then what you get is a kind of airing of dirty laundry in public. I think at this point, there's no avoiding that.
A couple of weeks ago, we spoke about this scandal with Will Hayward. He's Welsh Affairs Editor at Wales Online. We've clipped up a highlight of this to catch you up, so just search at PodSave the UK on YouTube to find us. And a quick reminder, we were squatting on the PodSave the World feed since we launched, but we've now been set free and we have our own PodSave the UK channel. So don't forget to subscribe if you want to see our faces and some fantastic extra content, including an interview about the UK-US special relationship with Ben Rhodes from PodSave the World.
But of course, Vaughan Gething is not the only resignation of the week. On Tuesday, Gareth Southgate resigned as the manager of the England men's football team after coming second in the Euros for the second time. But stay with us here. Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy has been singing Southgate's praises this week and saying that the country should be more Gareth Southgate, less Michael Gove. Now, I have always believed that everyone should be less Michael Gove, if possible. But Liz, can you just dig into what that means in terms of what's the political messaging behind what Lisa Nandy's saying?
When I heard that, I was like, it's such a kind of tortured analogy, because it just you have to bring just so much knowledge to the table, because you kind of think, oh, she's going to compare, we need to be more Gareth Southgate and less. I was going to say another football manager, but I can't. I literally can't even think of one. But I was like,
Jose Mourinho is a cartoon villain from the world of football management.
Sure, exactly, yeah. Like, we should all be more Gareth Southgate and less Jose Mourinho, because whatever, we should all be more about unity and less about division. Yeah. And yet she went into Michael Gove, which I think a lot of people would have been like, oh yeah, I was with you for Gareth Southgate. We should all be more Gareth Southgate, but why should we be less Michael Gove?
Potentially, did she mean, do you want to move away from indulging in divisive cultural politics? I mean, Southgate did, he'll get praised and criticised in various areas of the media, in sport and politics over the next couple of weeks, as he has done for the last couple of years. But one of the things that he did do is attempt to redefine a version of Englishness that maybe is more recognisable to people who actually live in England.
I do think that what Gareth Southgate has shown is possible is you can kind of detoxify patriotism and put forward a kind of view of Englishness that feels really inclusive.
I think it's very hard sometimes to conceptualise Gareth Southgate standing by black players who were racially abused after missing penalties, but also standing by black and white players on his team that took a public stand against racism. I think in some ways that he has a legacy outside football that I think it's hard to think of another England manager in my lifetime that has done that.
Well, didn't Nandy say something to that effect, saying that, he's got a massive contribution to make? I'm paraphrasing, but I got the sense that she was hinting that maybe Gareth Southgate might have something to do with the next Labour government.
This is the quote. The truth is he's got an enormous contribution to make. He's already making it. And I'm really looking forward to working with him as the newly appointed Culture Secretary for however long that lasts.
What does that mean? Really looking forward to working with him?
Southgate about to take over the English National Opera. Well, you heard it here first, folks.
I would love to see Gareth Southgate in the Lords, Junior Minister. I think he'd be great.
It couldn't be more inexplicable than putting Cameron in the Lords so he could be Foreign Secretary. That's all I'm saying.
I honestly think it would be extremely popular. But I do think it's a good point about Gareth Southgate, and hopefully the kind of spectre of Gareth Southgate hanging over this new government will encourage this idea of leadership as something where you do speak out when it's difficult, you do take difficult decisions, and you can hold on to your integrity in public life.
And crucially, the public will turn on you no matter how good you are, which is what I saw with Gareth Southgate.
For sure.
But people
That's
were
the
so
British
mean
public.
about him,
Yeah,
innit?
I don't think we should read too much into Britain or the British public. I think that is a specific disease of the English football fan. Gareth Southgate is the most successful English manager since Alf Ramsey. There is a big old gap from second to third place.
What podcast are we on now?
Sorry,
is this the
we're on
Football
Pod Save the
Ramble?
Football. I'm
Okay.
sorry. We're on Pod Save the Football. After the break, let's get ourselves back on track when we're joined by two very special guests to discuss one of the new government's greatest policy challenges, education.
Moving on to one of the prickliest issues that Labour have to deal with, education. It's something that's very close to our own hearts. Nish and I were talking recently at a conference and we shared our education origin stories. Go on, you first, Nish.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm a very classic second generation child of immigrants whose pathway to success in this country is to work as hard as possible and then get their kids educated so that their kids can educate themselves into a higher social bracket. I guess my parents did not foresee that the education that I had would lead me to a career in comedy. Not only did they not foresee it, when it actually happened, they were initially quite angry about it. But my education is the reason that I do comedy. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but because I went to university, I got the opportunity to go to the Edinburgh Fringe and start doing comedy in quite a protected environment. I'm not sure I would have been able to do it outside of that. So I am very lucky to have had the education that I've had, because in the end, it ended up being the most vocational possible university experience. And I'm very passionate about pushing back against this idea that, well, maybe not everyone should go to university. I mean, it's true that not everyone should go to university, but I feel like when the people say that, what they're talking about is rich people can go to university and do whatever they want. The university experience I had was a pathway to a career in the arts for me. And so I'm very, very grateful for it.
And that's why the Conservatives wanted to shut it down, so that people like you didn't go to university and didn't end up a thorn in their side. It's interesting hearing you talk about the arts there, because particularly arts education has just been like slashed to smithereens and what that means for young people. And I think, you know, for a lot of like working class kids, the arts is a way out. It's a way to elevate yourself, to like reach your full potential, to learn your own skills. You can do that with being great at like maths and science and technology and PE and other stuff as well. But like, the arts is significant, certainly for me personally. In terms of my education origin story, basically, went to a comp in Barking and Dagenham where gentrification dare not tread. It's not, no East London gentrification has happened there. And it was weird because I was a bit of a badly behaved kid. I'm sure you're surprised to hear, because I'm so charming and lovely now.
Not even batting an eyelid.
But, because home was quite difficult. Obviously, single parent family, single parent, immigrant parent. And just from a young age, like money's tight, everything's a bit chaotic. I had relatives with illness, even caring responsibilities from quite a young age. And so I know on reflection that I was acting out a bit at school, but I got really good grades. And I had one teacher who just moved heaven and earth for me, basically. Yeah. And she, I remember once we're all being sent off for the end of term, and the last class was English. It was my English teacher who did this. She sort of called me back and was like, right, listen to me. I think the reason you're really badly behaved is because you're actually not stimulated enough. You're not, you haven't found your passion, basically. She was like, and I think English probably is your passion. So I'm going to give you a book and I want you to read this over half term. We're going to be studying it next term, and I'm giving it to you now so that you can rule the roost. You can lead everyone else next term.
Right.
Anyway, she gave me that book, and it was obviously a very cliche book to give to an angry young person. It was JD Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. But
it's the most incel thing about you.
I know. But I devoured it in 2 days, and she was right. I was like, wow, I really love the power of literature. I really love books. Came back the next term, really felt inspired. That sort of changed the course of my life. Did English at university, then started writing, then went into journalism, obviously then ended up at The Guardian. Again, this is why the Tories wanted to cut it. So people like me didn't end up writing shit about them. But anyway, I think it's just worth saying that, as two hosts, we've benefited from opportunities that we're really aware the young kids in school today are not getting.
But the education system does look incredibly different today than when we were at school in the late 90s and early 2000s. And there are many crises that need addressing. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, we've seen historically large cuts to school spending per pupil, whilst teachers have seen a real terms reduction, that's their salaries adjusted for inflation, in those salaries since 2010. And so that's 14 years of effectively falling wages. It's not even just that. I mean, the crisis in the education system seems to have sort of manifested itself in school buildings themselves. Like last year, 276 schools had to close because they're built with a dangerous crumbling concrete known as rack.
Meanwhile, the UK has seen soaring levels of child poverty, increasing special educational needs and a widening attainment gap. Schools are witnessing an attendance crisis, up 60% on pre-pandemic levels, with 1 in 5 children persistently absent. Most concerningly, though, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have said that schools are staggering under the pressure of demand. It's amid an epidemic of extreme poverty, and it's been said that schools have become the 4th emergency service due to poor mental health and social care for young people. So really, yeah, teachers are filling in, doing much more than just delivering an education. They're providing mental health support. They're often providing even, poverty support and things like food banks being run out of schools, things like that.
Yeah, it's a sector that is struggling to deliver what it's supposed to be delivering, which is an education to children. And on top of that, it's being asked to fill in other gaps amidst the sort of collapsing infrastructure of our society. And the crisis continues outside of schools. In a 2021 report from UNICEF ranking rich countries in terms of childcare provision, put the UK almost at the bottom. The quality of British provision was regarded as so poor that it could not even be given a rating.
That was a whistle-stop tour, and it's obviously been a long time since we were in school. So joining us
a long time.
A reasonable amount of time. Let's not go with long. This is all part of my anxieties about getting old. I am 21, actually. My age is not. It is redacted. So joining us on Pod Save the UK are Angel and Jaden, 2 young people with serious thoughts on the education sector and the challenges facing our new government. Welcome to Pod Save the UK, guys.
Thank you. I'm very excited.
Let's introduce yourself. So Jaden, in a line, tell me about you.
So my name's Jaden. I'm 19. I'm from Liverpool, but I currently live in the West Midlands. I moved here 3 years ago, so I've done college here, and I've been doing youth advocacy and some youth work the past 3 years.
Great. And Angel?
Hi everyone, my name's Angel. I'm the current Miss Teen Nigeria UK, and I'm also on the Nottinghamshire Youth Commission and the Fair Education Alliance Youth Steering Group, and I'm 17.
That's why we met these 2 young people.
Yes.
Because we interviewed you guys at the Fair Education Alliance conference, and we were so impressed by these young people, we thought, we've got to get them on the podcast. We've got to get these impressive young people on the podcast. Starting with Jaden, why don't you talk us through the challenges that you've faced in your own education and the issues that you've observed being in school in the last 10 years?
For me, one of the biggest issues was staffing. I just didn't have enough teachers. Well, nobody really did. A lot of my teachers, if I did manage to have some for my subject, were either split between 2, 3, sometimes even more on a bad day. 3 more classrooms, and each classroom had about 30 students each. So there just wasn't a high level, high quality level of teaching, because people were having probably a mini total with a teacher, and including that staffing issue. There was no Senko, so I had a late diagnosis of autism, dyslexia, so I didn't have any accommodations for my the actual learning when it came to the exams. So that, alongside some other socioeconomic issues, I didn't have all the textbooks that I needed. For half my GCSEs, didn't have Wi-Fi at home. I did fall behind quite easily, especially with having some physical disabilities, which meant that I had to have time off from school. It just I fell behind and there wasn't enough time to catch up.
And Angel, what about you? You've got an interesting education story because you've been educated in private schools and obviously in the state sector. I mean, what were some of the biggest challenges that you observed?
Yeah, so for me, it was structural racism and the idea of the labelling theory. I felt I experienced a lot of racism, and I was labelled by teachers and students, and yeah, it really harmed my growth, I guess. And also the pastoral system that was set in place wasn't really for me, and I guess when I complained, it seemed like I just had attitude and I wasn't helped at all when I experienced it in private education. But when I went to a public school, I really enjoyed it and I was given the guidance and the growth that I needed. And I was also supported. I found out that I had learning difficulties like a few years later. And when I addressed those issues to the private school that I was in, like there was no help given. So I think that's a really big thing.
Based on your experiences of the kind of challenges and difficulties within the education sector, what are the things that a new government needs to change or needs to address most urgently?
Coming from my experiences, the issue of staffing is there's some severe cases like my school, it was like in special measures. A lot of teachers have to be like made redundant because the school just losing more and more funding. So I do think that the initiative to get more teachers into school by scrapping the VAT exemption of private schools is something that is beneficial, but I don't think it's necessarily doing enough. I don't think it's enough teachers, and that's not addressing why teachers are leaving, why there's a quick turnover. A lot of teachers are leaving within their first year after they've trained, and it's not addressing that issue. So many teachers are too overworked, they're not getting paid enough, and there's just so many other issues. Like, a lot of teachers have said that the behaviour of students is quite off-putting, and I think that that's something that can be solved with like free school meals. A lot of young people are food insecure. Too many aren't able to access a meal at home or in school. So having that, it will obviously help with the energy, and I think it's going to improve behaviour, and that's another way that can keep teachers in the position.
Angel, what would you say would be, because again, like as we say, you've got such an interesting story. You were a scholarship kid that ended up going to a private school and then actually going back into the state sector and having a more positive experience. What would you say are kind of short-term goals for a new government in regards to education policy?
I would say like increasing representation, because for me, I didn't have any Black teachers in my school and I felt very isolated and alone. So having that representation of seeing someone who looks like you in large leadership roles is so important. And also just in creating more inclusive environments. So for example, in private schools, it's mostly sports like hockey and rugby. And usually they're not really diverse teams at all. So creating more representation, providing more funding so kids from working class backgrounds and ethnic minority backgrounds are able to go into those sports and I guess become the new teams that we see on the screen. That would be amazing.
Well, you're both incredibly impressive. I am amazed at the amount of poise and composure you have at that age.
I know.
I think if somebody had asked me how to fix the school sector when I was 18, I'd have gone, just burn them all down, man.
Mate, I was listening to a lot of Linkin Park at that age. So
if there was one immediate policy that you would suggest the government bring in regards to education, or not, if you just fancy freestyling some legislation, if there was one kind of immediate thing that you both think it would be worth bringing in, what would you go with?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'd say developing inclusive support systems, because I think that covers a lot of the issues in education in terms of teachers and students. Just developing that inclusiveness so everyone feels welcome in the education system and we're able to encourage each other, I think would be great.
Jaden, what would you say would be one policy you'd love to see brought in the short term?
I think something to target early years development. I think that is something that's really important to me. I think a lot of initiatives start a lot too late. They focus on the age group that like starting their GCSEs, so like 14, 15, like when people are like in year 9 and 10. And I think at that point, a lot of people have become disengaged from education. I think at that point, it is a bit too late, because if people have been disengaged and they're not achieving grades that they desire, it's going to be really hard for them to be able to catch up. And I definitely think that COVID kind of highlighted that issue.
Jaden, Angel, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with your exam results and stay in school, kids. Never sound older.
Never say that.
Labour have made education number 4 of their 5 missions to rebuild Britain, pledging to break down barriers to opportunity by reforming our childcare and education systems. Here's newly appointed Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson speaking on Friday to ITV's Tom Sheldrick.
The process that we've begun is around how we tackle issues around attendance, which has a big impact on children's outcomes. We know if children aren't in school, they aren't learning, then that problem is going to continue. But we need also more teachers in our classrooms. We face some big vacancy rates and sadly too many children being taught by teachers who are not specialist in their fields. We've begun that process already to get 6,500 new teachers into our classrooms, but there is much more that we will need to do in the weeks and months to come.
Now, Phillipson was mostly laying out the government's plans for education reform. They've pledged to hire 6,400 teachers funded by the ending of tax breaks for private schools and scrap single-word Ofsted grades, as well as launch an expert review of the school curriculum and fund free breakfast clubs in every primary school.
So to help us understand the party's ambitious plans and how Phillipson intends to put them into action, we're joined by Janeen Hayat, who's the Director of Collective Action at the Fair Education Alliance, a collection of nearly 300 organisations tackling educational inequality. Janeen, it's great to have you on Pods Over the UK.
Thanks. It's really nice to be here.
We came and did an interview for you guys at your conference.
And it was brilliant having you guys at the Fair Education Summit.
Thank you. That's why I raised it.
Yeah.
We're just trying to crow our compliments for ourselves.
That was
in
a
the way
top
possible.
5 moment for both of us.
There's been a lot of noise around Labour's education plans. They're really making it a central part of their offering to the public as a new government. What do you think are the sort of easy wins here in terms of their first couple of priorities?
I almost don't want to answer that question. I think the problem is the root causes of a lot of the symptoms we're seeing in education are not easy to fix. So you just heard Bridget Phillipson talk about attendance. We have big attendance problem in the country. I think persistent absence, which is missing a day a fortnight, is over 20%. Severe absence, which is missing 50% or more of school, I think it's about 2%. And the rates are much higher if you are eligible for free school meals. So if you're from a low-income household. So that's a massive problem, right? But what's driving that problem? Like, why aren't they turning up? So I'd like to kind of focus on the root causes of that. Or the teacher recruitment and retention crisis, which is another one that's really like broken through to mainstream media. Why are they leaving, right? Because Labour have pledged 6,500 new teachers, which is great. But retention is actually a bigger issue than recruitment. We have more teachers leaving classrooms in the last few years than we ever had before. I think it's 44% of teachers said that they kind of are considering leaving in the next 5 years. And that's losing experience. It's losing people you've invested in. And so kind of there's the quick wins of like, how do we drive that number up and fill the gaps? But also we really need to think about in a decade, how are we going to have that profession be more sustainable for the people who are in it, and particularly the people who are teaching the most challenging schools.
I just want to go back to the attendance points you made there. You know, there's a variety of reasons of why this happens. What actually are those reasons?
Children feeling like they don't have a way to thrive at school or have like a sense of belonging at school. So we've seen kind of a narrowing of the curriculum and a really kind of target-driven approach to educational outcomes. But a side effect of that has been kind of some children losing the things that they really enjoyed about school and the things that made them feel at home there. And we know we have a mental health crisis in young people as well. And combine that with rising child poverty and the fracturing of services that we're seeing in communities. And you have rising need, mental health need, but also all sorts of need, housing, food, gaps in the social care system. And so all of those needs are also kind of barriers to children getting into school and being ready to learn.
I just want to circle back briefly to this idea about changing the curriculum. So one of the things that Labour's proposing is a review of the school curriculum, and that sense that, as you say, it's become too narrow and academic, and this is going to require more funding in order to execute a broadening of the curriculum, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's something that looks quite cheap on its face, right? But then like has this cost in workload on teachers and in the time and energy it takes to implement a curriculum reform. One thing I'll say is that's why we need to think really long-term about it, like not bring in a change overnight and say, get on with it. But what we know we have a big gap in across the board is the skills that employers need. And that's a big driver of youth unemployment. So I think if you work backwards to how can the school system build some of those essential skills that we know are needed, like kind of across industries and regardless of technological development, right? We know that like employers are saying that things like communication and teamwork, creativity are things that they're not seeing in people entering the workforce. it seems clear that we kind of need to prioritize activities and a mix of things to help people build those skills is one thing. What young people want to see in school, we should absolutely be talking to them and involving them, putting them at the front, but also gathering data about like all of the holistic things, like what do you like about school, or what stops you from going to school, or when do you feel most at home there? But I think we have to be honest about the fact that something has to change, and we need to have a plan for bringing that change in sustainably over the next decade.
I mean, one of the things me and Nish were talking about was we were having our misty-eyed recollections of when we were in school. And of course, exams were important, but there's definitely been a shift towards a kind of like the exams and the exam results being the be-all and end-all. And so there's talk about moving away from that. And also, you know, I suppose in a way coinciding with that is talk about like how schools are assessed, both in terms of their exam results, but also in terms of Ofsted assessments. So the single word Ofsted judgment would be replaced with a scorecard system. I'm sure many of our listeners will be familiar of walking past a school and they have a big banner that says fair, which seems a bit cruel, just fair. And there'll also be inspections of multi-academy trusts, and there'll be an introduction of a new annual review of safeguarding practices, as well as attendance and off-rolling. Off-rolling is the practice of removing a pupil from the school roll without a permanent exclusion. Do you think all these things together could create conditions that are better for teachers, where they can actually experience infusing young people with the passions of their subject?
Yeah, I think it's really early days, so I think they absolutely could. A huge part of Ofsted has been what results are the kids getting. And you can see why. It's hugely important. That's a barrier to progressing in education. It's a barrier to employment. But I think there have been some unintended consequences of schools, you know, off-rolling pupils who aren't going to get those results, or of teachers kind of feeling more pressure if they're teaching in really challenging schools, because they can't focus on results as much because they're focusing on this really complex work of mitigating the impacts of poverty. There are more food banks in schools than any other kinds of food banks. There are schools providing transportation to students, buying washing machines for parents, making sure their kids have beds to sleep in. And in some ways, it's really amazing to see schools doing that work with no additional funding. But that complex work isn't fully recognized by Ofsted, and it's not rewarded. And you can't possibly do everything.
I want to talk to you about where we are so far with the new government. Government is so far missing a commitment to protect per school funding. So will the £1.5 billion raised from taxing private schools be enough to reverse 14 years of austerity and fulfill the kind of key promise on education, which is raising school standards for every child?
I think the answer is no. And I think money is the huge challenge. Whenever I listen to your housing episode, and I think as you zoom in on like every social issue, you're gonna like run into the exact same problem, which is everyone is skint and everything massively needs investments. There isn't going to be enough money to restore everything to the real terms funding levels that were there a couple of decades ago. So I think the big challenge for this government is going to be striking that balance between how do we make investments for the kids who are in the system now while doing this long-term work. And there are, capital investments that need to be made in schools. Like we know, like there are buildings that are dangerous. We had the rack scandal not that long ago, and kind of everyone's forgotten about that, but it's still there. It's not fixed. However, I would say that there's lots we can do that doesn't necessarily cost that much money. One is shifting the incentives in the system and shifting what we value in the system. So teaching is maybe not competitive with other professions in the manner of pay, but we've been looking at how do you make teaching more competitive with other professions in making it more flexible for people with caring responsibilities, making it more diverse and inclusive.
Just to home in on and be specific to education, externally, just as somebody who's seen the election result, sees the size of the Labour majority, you'd be forgiven for just assuming, well, they can just do whatever they want, right? But in terms of education specifically, what are some of the kind of political roadblocks to enacting some of these reforms?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is making the sell for long-term investment that's not necessarily going to have demonstrable, shiny wins. But what we're asking for is this like recognition of the complex work teachers in the most challenging schools do, and working towards a more sustainable profession that's more competitive in ways other than pay and more pay. The use of school space for nurseries that Labour has announced is really welcome because it's going to create supply in lower income communities, and it's going to better able nurseries to meet the needs of kids with special educational needs. Again, like we have a big early years workforce problem, and we have an issue with kids who spend their first 5 years at home. All of the services that support them, everything that used to be there for a parent, has been kind of eroded. So we're going to need to like kind of rebuild all of those like ways of collaboration and networks.
Janeen, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
It's been really lovely. And if I could make a last plug for the Fair Education Alliance too, have a look at our website, have a look at our priorities for new government, and get in touch at info@faireducation.org.uk if you are a business or charity or school or trust who would like to work collaboratively with us.
The
Great.
listenership of this podcast, guaranteed there's people who work in education.
Yeah, for sure.
I know the hippies that listen to this thing.
So there have been rumours flying around Westminster that Conservative MP and former Foreign Secretary James Cleverly was a fan of Warhammer. And in a huge day for gaming nerds, Cleverly has come clean, posting a selfie on X with a freshly painted Warhammer figurine.
Yeah, apparently hundreds of fellow Warhammer players have replied. But we should clarify what Warhammer is, right? It's a sort of, it's a fantasy-based kind of tactical game that involves these little figurines that you can buy and paint. Liz Bates is still with us. Liz, do you think, is this part of James Cleverly's push to present himself as the unity candidate for Tory leader? He can unify the right. He can unify the centre. He can unify the nerds. Is this part of the push?
Yes, exactly. This is him appealing to every part of the nation, including people that like Warhammer, which I don't know. I literally can't even picture Warhammer, so I'm so sorry. I'm bringing.
It's got the word war in it, though, so
it's
isn't
not
it a bit
appealing to
divisiony?
me. If he wants to appeal to me as a voter, he needs to be like, and I also love the Sex and the City films.
Gee, well, we'd know he was lying.
Yeah.
So look, if Cleverly's positioning himself as the Warhammer unity candidate, there were areas of the Conservative Party elsewhere that the unity was not particularly evident. A row broke out between potential Tory leadership rivals Suella Braverman and Kemi Badenoch. The Times reported that Badenoch accused Braverman of having a very public nervous breakdown. Suella then took to X to pop back at Badenoch saying, I'd be interested in knowing whether Kemi thinks I'm having a very public nervous breakdown, adding the hashtag we don't leak.
So the funny thing about Kemi Badenoch's comments is that she said them in a meeting, a private meeting with some cabinet colleagues, I think, and there was a big long list of things that were leaked to Stephen Swinford, who is a journalist at the Times, and it was like, you know, she said this and this and this, and she said, you know, I think Suella Braverman's having a public nervous breakdown. And then at the end it said, and she also spoke about the importance of not leaking these private meetings to journalists. And then someone immediately leaked it to a journalist. And then I loved the fact that Suella Braverman then immediately reacted in a way that suggests that, yes, she is having a public nervous breakdown, because the first thing you would do if you are having a nervous breakdown is reply on Twitter.
Hashtag we don't leak.
Yeah.
So I think what Badenoch got wrong was to imagine it's just Braverman who's having the breakdown. It feels like the entire Tory party is having a very long and public breakdown. Terrifyingly, Priti Patel appears ready to enter the race this week. When will we see a new leader emerge? Possibly after the Conservative National Conference in late September. Personally, I'm just afraid. I just have a general feeling of dread all the way up to it.
I think, you know, one of the interesting things about the Conservative Party now is it's going to go through, you kind of look at it and think there's nothing you can do now. Everything's going to fall apart because they've been through this like horrendous general election result. I don't think they've really, some of them, accepted how bad it was. And we even, you know, we saw this with the Labour Party after their many now election losses, is that they say to each other all the time, we desperately need to come together, we need a unity candidate, we need to stop infighting. But once you get to this position where you've had a big election loss, and there's been so many different factions kind of fighting each other for years. Now it's all like powder keg out in the open. There's no way to avoid these very public spats, and they're all going to be fighting like rats in a sack to, take over the Conservative Party. Because if you were left now, I mean, they are now into a period of real irrelevance. So they're all desperately scrambling now to take power, so that at least they can be, in a senior position in opposition to hold on to that feeling of we still have some power in British politics. So I think that's what you're going to see.
One person who will definitely not be leading the Conservative Party because he's no longer an MP is Jacob Rees-Mogg. And his family are about to start, I can't believe I'm having to read this out, are about to start in a new fly-on-the-wall documentary series called Meet the Rees-Moggs, which promises a never-before-seen look, which I would update as a phrase to never ever wanted to fucking see in my life look, into the life of the ex-MP, who once said that he famously said that he's never changed a single nappy despite having 6 children. He said the nanny does it brilliantly, and he said, I've made no pretense to be a modern man at all, ever. He's not the first politician to dip his toe into reality television. Matt Hancock and Nigel Farage did stints on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Why can't we just let these people fuck off? Why is reality TV obsessed with rehabilitating the reputations of some, some of the less salubrious members of our political establishment?
You scratch the surface of the British public and we're sort of a bunch of snivelling peasants, really. We have this kind of sick thing where we just love to be lauded over by posh people.
Speak for yourself. I am a child of the empire. Not so much for me. I would just say, if any of our American listeners are listening to this podcast, I have no doubt that Meet the Rees-Moggs is going to make its way to America. I know that in America, a lot of British reality TV is quite popular at the moment. And I just urge you, when your friends tell you about Meet the Rees-Moggs, just tell them no.
It will be funny. And I hate to say this as well, but he's so pleasant in person. I went for lunch with him, and when I went to the toilet, he stood up as I went to the toilet out of, courtesy.
I have no interest in lunching with him or watching him on a television programme. I wish he would simply fuck off. Well, that's it. Unbelievably. That is the end of the episode. Thanks for joining us here on our new YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications whenever we post new content.
And don't be afraid to drop a comment down below to let us know what you think.
Nothing fruity.